How can cities ensure mobility as a service is a boon and not a bust? Please welcome back your moderator, Caroline Daniel of the Brunswick Group. Jan Vapaavuori, Mayor of Helsinki. Rebekah Scheinfeld, former Commissioner of Chicago's Department of Transportation. Sam Schwartz of Sam Schwartz Transportation Consultants. Deputy Mayor of Transport for London, Heidi Alexander, and Uber's Chris Pangilinan.
Good morning again. So mass transport used to be something we all understood, but now we're talking about a different kind of mass transport, which is mobility as a service mass transport. Everyone in this panel has a lot to say about it, so I'm going to get going rather than introducing you all again. So I'd like to start with Jan, and as Mayor of Helsinki. I'd love to know why you've decided that this was a very important kind of policy area to try and lead on as a global city, and also how you've gone about doing that. And just to frame the conversation for the audience, which everyone doesn't necessarily know what mobility as a service means, I'd love you to sort of articulate what the ambition is here.
Different people refer to different things when they discuss MaaS. Some people refer to all the disruption which is taking place in the mobility sector. In Finland and Helsinki, it has a little bit more limited scope. You could say that the traditional model was that individual different transportation modes try to be as user-friendly as possible and then compete with each other. But what MaaS does is that it makes alternative transportation modes to line up and from that position compete with the private car. And in order to make that happen, of course, we need a flexible regulatory basis. And what we did in Finland is that so all providers of transportation services are by law required to open up the ticket and payment interfaces to third parties. Why we're doing this is that I think it's not useful to discuss whether the disruption within the mobility sector is a good thing or bad thing, because it will take place regardless of our action. Cities are, and our ultimate goal is to provide the best possible circumstances for a good life. Mobility is a big part of your life, so we try to get the best use of the new opportunities the technology is providing us.
So what difference has it made so far? What can you point to about this as actually delivering value?
The basic idea with the product of MaaS Global, which is the company, and the product is called WEM, is to combine like services like public transport, city bikes, taxis, even rental cars in a flexible way in order to take into account the fact that we have so many people who need a private car every now and then. And so far, most of them have bought a car in order to use the car every now and then. But now the idea is to provide a system where they can use a car every now and then when they need it without owning a car. And in that way, to try to encourage people to use more public transport and also other sustainable modes like walking and cycling.
So do you think, as you look ahead as Mayor of Finland, that...
Mayor of Helsinki.
Mayor of Helsinki, of course. Not yet. So you talked backstage about how you want to lead in systemic demonstrations and pilots as a city. Can you just explain what that means in the transport space? What are we going to see next from you?
I think that we are witnessing a huge disruption going on. We have electric vehicles, we have autonomous vehicles, we have sharing economy, we have different kinds of MaaS products, all taking place at the same time. And then new transportation modes like scooters and drones and so on. And I think no one really knows what's the combined effect of all of this. And cities are in the core of solving these issues, but no one actually knows what to do. And that's why we need also demonstrations and pilots, and we need them on systemic level. And I think that one of the strengths of the city of Helsinki is that we are at the same time, we are big enough to enable demonstrations on systemic level, but at the same time not as big as London or Chicago, so we are also at the same time small enough and functional enough in order to make that happen. So I think that in many cases you can't like start a systemic change in cities like London, Chicago, New York without testing that in a little bit smaller scale in a really functional city like the city of Helsinki.
And I'm just going to add, before I move on, that you also were involved in a recent drone delivery experiment. Do you want to just explain that very quickly?
I think that I was certainly the first one in Europe, maybe the first one in the world in urban circumstances to receive a lunch delivered by a drone, because the former Google X company Boon decided to pilot this product in Helsinki. They have done it, I know, in Australia at least, in the countryside, but Helsinki became the first city for their tests.
So, and apparently it was a salmon salad, if anyone wants.
It was, yes, a really good one.
Yeah. So I'd like to come to you, Chris, on the private sector side. And obviously Uber has a similar big ambition for mobility as a service, and has, your CEO has talked about the desire to be the Amazon of transportation. I wonder if you can just also sort of frame the private sector big ambition for this area.
Sure. So I'd like to start with the commonality too, in that I think the mayor put it really well, in that there's a lot of people who buy cars to own cars full time when they only need to take it part time or for a few trips. But what ends up happening is once you own that asset, you end up using that car all the time for all your trips, even though there's many other modes that could be a lot better for that, for the city and for you as a car owner. And so what we're doing at Uber is to create a system and a web of all the different modes that could potentially fit all the different trip types that everybody needs to make. So we're rolling out, of course, bikes and scooters, as everyone has seen that. We have our traditional ride sharing and carpooling, but also, and this is where my role has come in, is to work with public transportation, as we recognize that public transportation still needs to be the backbone of any mobility as a service transportation in any urban area, as of course public transportation moves the greatest number of people in the most efficient manner. But with the Uber system, what we want to create is that mobility as a service where you can choose whichever mode that you might need at that particular time. Perhaps it's late at night, perhaps it's in a less dense area, where a bike or a scooter or maybe even a rideshare might actually be the best way to get around. So ideally, if we can create that system for people, they'll be less incentivized to even buy that car in the first place, perhaps even sell that second or even their primary car, and use all the systems of transportation in the city to meet their needs.
So I was interested, speaking backstage, about how the people involved in cities were talking very much about the city view of transportation. And Uber tends to, we were talking, and it was very much the kind of, what's the user view, the consumer aspiration. So do you think there is a tension between sort of what users generally want, which is probably a one-stop shop in one place, versus different kind of levels of priorities between users and cities?
Yeah, I think it's the classic contrast between what we want as individuals and what we need as a society or as a city. And this is going to be, a contrast that's as old as time, of course. But I think in transportation, it's very acute, given that we have such limited space in an urban area, and so we really see it playing out on a day-to-day basis. I think if we all had our way, we would all get in helicopters and get everywhere we want to go. But of course, that would be terrible for the environment and terrible for space, and we can't do that. Not everybody can do that. And so what we need to do is find that right balance between how do we serve individual travelers to meet their needs, but also recognize that we all can't be doing our own thing if we want to live in a city together. And I think that's where cities can really come into play, is to set those guardrails and those incentives and help guide these private companies such as mine to both meet the individual traveler needs as well as meet what the cities want to meet as well.
But isn't there, again, from where you sit, a tension between the public and private provision inherently? And there are lots of studies which show that actually Uber and Lyft and some of the other service providers have added to congestion in cities, not taken it away. So how do you respond to that sort of, you have a very good ambition for what mobility and services will do, but some people experience it in a different way, particularly cities? Yeah,
and I think it's an interesting question that we have to look at the way that congestion can play a role in positive or negative effects in a city. And I think if you look at the positive side, congestion is a good sign of economic health and that people are actually traveling and doing what they want to do, that they're actually getting to their social activities, to their jobs, whatever it might be. But But sometimes in a certain amount of period during the day, there's too many of us doing that in perhaps the wrong modes, and of course that's where we get the congestion issue. But I think if we can find ways to protect public transportation during these times with bus lanes, with more investment in exclusive right-of-way for transit, as well as looking at initiatives that we've supported as well, like the congestion pricing plan in New York, that of course is being done, that is done in London and in Stockholm. Those, I think, can help mitigate the impacts of, and help balance the way that people want to get around in these easier to use the modes that are coming up today.
And Heidi, I'd like to bring you in here from London. I'm not going to start talking about the congestion in London, but I'd love to hear your perspective as running such a big sort of part of the sort of transport system in London, how you see this debate, and particularly around the balance between the public and private sector, and how to get those lines of engagement correct, because obviously there's a real danger for a city such as London to hand over too much of this sort of authority over the transit system to the private sector apps or platforms. Who is the right platform for this? Should it be the city or a big private company?
Well, I think the Public Transport Authority in London has to be involved in these discussions, and I'm not saying that we've got it completely right at the moment about the way in which we work with the private sector.
What do you think you've got not right then?
Well, I think we need to look more innovatively about how we work together. Where we have been very clear, though, is the principles by which we will assess new forms of mobility, new technology. We've set out 7 principles in the Mayor's Transport Strategy, which is about, do these new forms of mobility complement the public transport system? Really reassuring to hear Chris talk about public transit as the backbone of a mobility as a service platform. We have some really big ambitions in London about reducing the dominance of cars on our road. At the moment, about 63% of journeys in London are done by people walking, cycling, or using public transport. And over the next 2 decades, we want to take that figure up to 80%. What that means in practice is reducing the number of car journeys daily by 3 million. And whilst we've done a lot of really innovative things, over the last couple of decades with congestion pricing, I think what we need to be doing now is to think about how we might partner with third sector private companies. I mean, it might be a bit easier if you're talking about an electric bike company, a dockless bike company, which is going to help make people healthier, that's going to help clean our environment up. But if you're talking about taking people off public transport and putting them into a car which they might not own, but nevertheless it has the same knock-on impact on the quality of life in our city, what I don't want to be in a position of is simply replacing one type of traffic jam with another type of traffic jam. And I'm also really keen to make sure that people are building exercise into their daily lives. And so if innovation and new forms of mobility are going to lead to less active travel and more passive travel, I think that's a problem as well.
So again, we spoke backstage about you said that despite all the innovation and all the technology which is being applied to sort of improve transportation, actually a lot of the congestion is still as bad as it was 20 years ago. So how far is this just like lots of running to catch up, or not even running anymore? Maybe we should just be running. But how far is it actually technology is just keeping us where we are already and not genuinely changing and being transformational?
Well, we have some really interesting data partnerships. So we've worked with Waze, for example. We've got a tunnel in the east of London, which is the only way you cross the river. It's called the Blackwall Tunnel. In 2017, it had to be closed 700 times, and a proportion of those are because simply people run out of fuel. So partnering with Waze to provide real-time reminders on the approach to the Blackwall Tunnel, that sort of thing, I think is quite a good collaboration between the public and private sector. There's a problem there that needs to be resolved. We're also doing some innovative work looking at how we can change our procurement processes, make them less elongated and much shorter, looking at ways in which we might make roadworks smarter. And this innovation is coming from small startups in the mobility industry. So we are starting to work together, but some of the disruption that we've experienced and the speed with which we've experienced it in the last couple of years for a big public transport authority like London that's trying to do a lot of really complicated things, build a £17 billion railway under London, introduce the world-leading ultra-low emission zone. We are, to be honest, sometimes running to catch up with this, and so that's why we've put in place an innovation directorate to try and get ahead of the curve on it.
And Rebekah, I'd like to bring you in from the Chicago perspective. You've just stood down overseeing the transportation system. What do you think are the biggest challenges you think you've seen in your experience in the role between that public-private balance and the ambition to have this sort of mobility as a service ambition, but actually there's just lots of stuff to do. The systems aren't always working and they're not joined up. And there are so many different kinds of initiatives now that actually we may want it to be simpler, but it just seems to be getting more and more complicated.
I think it comes to a very high level responsibility of government to establish what the vision is for mobility in a city. Transportation is the lifeblood of our cities, and we have to get it right. And it is the public sector's responsibility and duty to establish that framework and ensure that the regulations and the participation of private transportation providers are working within that system to promote and fulfill that vision. Otherwise, you've got a lot happening, and it's a lot of noise around the edges, and it's a lot of confusion and, frankly, a waste of people's time. And you won't get the right alignment between the interests of the public and the private sector to actually have fruitful new businesses and innovative partnerships that advance the mobility goals of the city. So the City of Chicago in the last year went through a process of engaging a task force made up of public and private sector participants, businesses, advocacy organizations, community-based organizations, to help bring that type of definition to what mobility needs to be in Chicago, working to harness the new transportation providers and new technologies that we have. So echoing a lot of what Heidi was talking about is happening in London. Customers are voting with their apps now. They are responding to businesses, and they are showing the latent demand for more choice. And so those are the same people that are our residents, our voters, and we have a duty to respond to them and fruitfully engage the private sector providers. So it's not a question of if, it's a question of how. And I think at a larger level, cities are a little bit on their heels right now, going through the last 5 or so years of very rapid change with a lot of new players in the transportation space that was previously relatively sleepy and dominated by public transportation systems. We should welcome this, but we need to guide it, and we need to establish that framework so that everything flows from it. So you have regulations that create the right incentives and disincentives for private providers to fulfill those goals, like reduced congestion, increased active transportation use, reduced car ownership, increased equity and access to transportation, increased options for people no matter where they live across the city. And then on the private side as well, trying to figure out how to respond to the rapid change in technology, all these different permutations and combinations of different types of technology and physical forms of transportation. Who knew we'd be talking today about e-scooter sharing being such a big phenomenon? 3 years ago, people would not necessarily have predicted this. So cities need a framework in which to evaluate these options and to determine how they can best be incorporated into a city to further the goals that are specific to that city.
So Sam, you're the last person to be brought in. I'm intrigued by the fact you wrote a book called No One at the Wheel, Driverless Cars on the Road of the Future. But my question is there anyone at the wheel in terms of the policy debate right now? It seems to be very sort of fractured, and lots of different people hold pieces of the puzzle. Mobility as a service is supposed to be one way of trying to coordinate all these opportunities into one kind of platform. And I'd love to get your take about, you've seen a lot of kind of public policy debates in your history. Is there anyone sort of at the wheel in charge of this, or is it companies like Uber who are actually really at the wheel?
Yeah, there is no one at the wheel. And if you look, and I'll stay in the United States for a moment, If you look at the policies that just came out of Washington in terms of the next generation transportation, which will be autonomous vehicles. Uber is already testing some driverless vehicles, but we know that that's the direction for many of those vehicles. What came out of Washington essentially says what's good for the autonomous vehicle industry is good for America. And states get out of the way, cities get out of the way, let the industry decide. Don't worry if they have any data, let it be on a voluntary basis. So we're in a bit of trouble. Everybody here talked about the rapid change that we've seen over the last few years. If you look at it, the scorecard from, let's say, a city's point of view or a society's point of view, it's quite negative. Of course, people voted, they like these new services on it, but congestion has worsened dramatically, not a little bit. The biggest drop in congestion, the number of vehicles traveled has increased beyond what we've seen. The number of people dying in crashes has reached levels we haven't seen in 20 or 30 years. So something is wrong with the picture there. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't have mobility as a service. It should be part of the equation. And what I know in Europe, you talked about a balanced form of transportation. You're looking at forms of transportation that don't cut into functional activity, for example. Those are the kinds of goals that we need. If we end up repeating history and what happened in the United States and then later on in Europe and other places, is we believed in the almighty automobile. And we turned over our streets and our roads and our highways to the point where we prohibited pedestrians who owned the streets, where we criminalized what they did on the streets. Now we have scooters, we have e-bikes, we have so many other things, and people are saying, that's dangerous. Well, maybe the dangerous thing are the cars. And maybe we have to rethink our streets going forward. But local governments and state governments have to take strong positions. And right now, fight Washington here. And what I see going on in Helsinki is wonderful. It's a balanced picture of what you're going to be offering. And in London, we're trying to emulate what you've done with congestion pricing. So jealous you beat us to it. But the kinds of thinking and kinds of forms of transportation alternatives that you're offering is what we in the United States should be taking a hard look at.
So Sam, I want to ask you about, this is such an important area for innovation for private companies, for everyone. And yet you're also seeing huge battles at the regulatory level between cities to compete to be the most open data, the most friendly to different companies. So there seems to be a real tension at the city level between being kind of really open and to invite in the private sector to be experimental, to be seen as innovative around these kind of offers and opportunities. And yet the same battle between, well, don't take away our sources of revenue for our own public transit system. So Jan, I wonder if you can sort of comment on that, and then Heidi, because I think there is a battle. Everyone's positioning themselves. I mean, you have as well around leading in this area.
First, you have to remember that cities are really complicated ecosystems with a wide variety of different kind of goals. So, of course, I mean, a convenient, pleasant, functioning mobility is a part of that. But we also want to be sustainable. We want to be safe. We care about the air and so on. So it's always a balance between very many kind of goals. Then another issue is that we have a very complicated world, and the power of the technological change is huge. I mean, many remember the disruption within the music industry a decade ago, and there were some who tried to fight against it. And I mean, more or less, they lost the game. But all in all, I think that the visibility to the future is actually quite limited. And I just give you one example, which we are discussing in Helsinki at the time being, that it's quite clear that the sharing economy will lead to a smaller amount of cars. But it do not necessarily mean less traffic. But if you have less cars, your question is whether you need less parking places. Maybe, yes, but maybe in some other places than so far. Because in today's world, the cars are parked next to your job or next to your home. But in the future, within the sharing economy, maybe the need for parking places is somewhere totally else. And that is, I think, maybe the core of the biggest problem of urban planning, where we are making decisions for the next 20 or 30 or 50 years, that the visibility of what's really going on or whether all the cars are flying in 10 or 20 years. So whether we need any streets at all.
Yeah. Heidi, I know you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I could sort of go back to one of the points I made earlier about replacing one type of traffic jam with another. And what we've seen in London, which is a city where half of households don't own a car, and yet we have a situation where our streets are still pretty much devoted to the car. We've seen
And yet it's still very hard to find a parking place.
Well, yeah, I mean, we could talk about parking forever, couldn't we? So we've seen the number of vans in central London increasing, and so, we need to find a way of actually creating healthier streets to give ourselves a healthier population. I don't think there are easy answers to this. It's a really, really contested space. I think one of the questions for a transport authority like TfL, which already sort of has a form of mobility as a service. We've got, 4 million people a day who use either contactless cards or Oyster cards as part of an integrated ticketing system to use buses, trams, tubes, trains. The big question for us that is, if I'm speaking totally frankly and honestly, is a big policy tension is, were we to partner with, say, a private e-bike provider, that could very well be taking revenue away from our bus system, but yet that may be, in terms of the outcomes for people in the city and for the environment of the city, a healthier, more sustainable option. And those are some of the big policy tensions that we're grappling with at the moment. And looking to sort of cities like Helsinki, which are smaller in size, but leading the way on some of this to help develop our thinking. I do think there's got to be a degree of honesty between the public and private sector in this, because whilst I want to do what is right for the city in the long term, and companies like Uber, it's refreshing to hear Chris talk about things such as public transport being the backbone of a MaaS platform. But I'm also quite conscious that as a private company, you are also looking at the returns to your shareholders. And in effect, your Uber jump bikes in London are a competitor to our docked bike hire service. And equally what I would say is that we have some tensions as a public transport authority. We operate services, we commission services, but we're also the regulator of services as well. And so companies that want to partner with us, we also need them as regulated entities to be playing by our rules as well. And so, all of that is a really, really complex and difficult picture to get right.
I have a lot more questions, but I know the audience has probably many more questions on top, so I'd just like to open it up for questions now. And then I'm going to finish with a question for each of you. Yes, in the middle, the lady in red. Lady in red.
Hi, I'm Lynn Osmond, Chicago Architecture Center. And our streets, we're talking about transportation, but it's really congestion too. And I know, Heidi, we do some work with Peter Murray in LA. And you're talking about congestion pricing on delivery vehicles and on-demand food services. Could you talk a bit about what's happening in that arena?
And now I'm just going to take a second question as well. The man standing up.
Hello, Remigius Masius. I'm Mayor of Vilnius, Lithuania. It will be more comment than a question, but the panel is invited to comment on this comment. We have a passion to talk about mobility as a service, but I sometimes have a very strange feeling that we treat service as a service delivered by a citizen to a city government in order to achieve some ambitious goals. But I think it's quite essential to think about a service which is, a citizen is getting by all providers of mobility services. And in a way, I think it's very important that at least we in Vilnius treat it as a service which is got by a citizen. And when we describe mobility as a service, it means that it should be easy to switch from one mode of transportation to the other mode of transportation. And it's not about the pushes from the governments to just to make a citizen work or ride or share or whatever. And I think when you accept this approach, you achieve much better results. And there is no dichotomy between private sector and public sector in this respect. And if you want to look how it works, so we have the biggest density of car sharing, maybe in the world, in Europe for sure. We have a purely integrated systems in Vilnius. So I think it's very important to understand this philosophy, because what I hear is very often about sometimes climate change, about health of people, but not a service to people.
Okay, thank you. Who would like to respond first? Heidi.
I think I was asked a specific question about congestion pricing. We're making a series of improvements to our road pricing schemes. The congestion charging zone came in back in 2003, so it's been in operation for 16 years. One of the things we've changed recently is to get rid of the exemption that we had for those 16 years for private hire vehicles. I won't go into the reason why that exemption was there to start off with. We're currently being challenged in court over our decision to remove that exemption, but that's one of the small things that we've done to actually update the congestion charging zone. But of course, 2 months ago, we introduced the world-leading ultra-low emission zone, which is a 24/7 charge on the most polluting vehicles entering the central congestion charging area. And in 2021, we will expand that emissions charge to a much wider geographical footprint, which is essentially, if you think of London as a sort of series of concentric rings, it's about halfway from the boundary of London into the centre, and that applies to all vehicles 24/7. So the charge, the combined charge, if you were entering central London in a polluting vehicle, and it's about our compliance rate at the moment on the ultra-low emission zone is at about 68%. So there's 32% of vehicles that are paying this. The combined charge is £24. And so that is quite a significant charge, but we spent a lot of time building the case for that around the poor air quality that is experienced in London, the number of schools, children in playgrounds that are breathing in dirty air, and so we've very much focused on that emissions piece more recently.
And Rebekah, you wanted to jump in.
Sure, and I think this segues to the second question and comment. I think that's a great example of how a city is, and the government is looking at the macro public policy considerations, providing real options for transportation, and then pricing appropriately to incentivize the behaviors that have the best outcome for the public good. And that's really what it comes down to. So the utopian vision is that we would have perfectly transparent information for all residents and visitors to a city about the different transportation options, and there would be many good options so that people can use those alone or in combination to end up with the most efficient trip that also reflects the public policy goals for the city. And so the city is obligated to establish regulatory schemes that have pricing incentives and disincentives and public space allocation that reflects those public policy goals to create those right levers. So for example, in Chicago, we have a tax on TNC providers, a portion of which goes to subsidize our public transit system, recognizing that trade-off and that tension at some level. That could become much more sophisticated to be variable based on time of day, location. Are you picking up and dropping off in the most congested central business district in the peak, or are you picking up and dropping off in the middle of the night or in an outlying neighborhood of the city that doesn't have as many transportation options? Similarly, how are we allocating our public right-of-way to prioritize the most efficient modes so that high-capacity, high-efficiency modes, whether it's the bus, the train, a bike, a scooter, or walking, are given more priority so that people can move more quickly and efficiently compared to a single-occupant vehicle. So those combined should, in theory, reflect in time travel savings and pricing that creates those right incentives and disincentives, and that there could be multiple apps that give that complete picture for everyone so they can make a choice based on their time availability and their pricing sensitivity to get to where they need to go on a daily basis and fulfill the city's policy goals.
Michael.
Yeah, thanks. And I think responding to this is a great discussion on that second comment. I think it's an interesting idea here now in this time of where we are in history that over the last 100 years, we've really in a lot of cities we've really only had maybe one or two private sector industries involved in transportation. We had, of course, taxis. Then we have all the car companies, all the private car ownership, and now all of a sudden we have all these different options, as you say, Rebekah. Like it's all like in the last 5 years really coming up, and I think this presents a really interesting opportunity for both the private sector and the public sector to work together to find out what it is that best serves people living in these cities, as well as the city's goals. And I think you see an interesting tension right now going on with the way that we just don't know how to regulate or what to regulate. And private sector, of course, as representing one at Uber, we of course have a duty to make a profit for our shareholders. But how is it that incentive can be combined with the incentives of cities in order to achieve that outcome? And I think, when we build the highways, we let private cars just kind of run all over our cities. There was none of that going on, and so we just had the outcome that we have today. But I also don't want to lean too far the other direction, where we do overreach, with our regulation and our other schemes, for a good intention, of course, but to the point where all of a sudden all these new modes that really are important to achieve our goals, such as reducing private car ownership and having green transportation options like scooters and bikes, all of a sudden don't become viable. And we want to make sure we don't go too far the other direction as well. And so it's an interesting tension that we do have here that I think all of us here in this room can help figure out.
I'm going to spend the last 3 minutes with a question for the panel, which I just want to throw this forward to the future, which is for each of you to just give an example of imagining the kind of transportation system of the future in your own cities or areas, and what you would love to see happen. So if you can make it as clear as possible rather than abstract as possible. Someone mentioned about, actually some of our systems may be completely disrupted by, new forms of aviation. So Jan, I'd like to start with you.
I think the most important in leading a city is to understand that, to have a comprehensive approach and holistic view, and that's why I don't like that much to come with some single examples. But if you need to give one, I'd like to see the city of Helsinki as an even more walkable city than what it is today. And I think that actually walking is the most sustainable, most healthy mode of transportation ever seen, and especially in today's world where we also have physical inactivity being one of the biggest problems in the world.
Right, that's not going to be great for Uber, but there we go. Rebekah, what would you love to see? If you had an ambition?
Another good story, probably not great for Uber, but in Chicago specifically, continued expansion of our public transportation options and prioritization of the public way for those, so that everyone's first choice and not their last choice is public transportation, and other modes, walking, biking, TNCs, private car use, are supporting that trunk, and that just being the most intuitive, simplest, safest, and most convenient and healthy way for people to get around wherever they need to go and wherever they're coming from.
And the Hyperloop and Elon Musk?
I think that the need to improve transportation options between the center of Chicago and O'Hare Airport has been a perennial question. That's how you have to think about that. With the $9 billion of investment in O'Hare Airport that is planned for the coming years, we're going to see 20,000 more trips a day between the central business district and O'Hare. And anyone who's visited here or lives here knows that our highway is completely capacity constrained in the peak. So is our rapid transit blue line. We need additional options, otherwise we're going to have more cars on the highway and pushing into our arterials. So whether it's Elon Musk or someone else or something else, that will be a perennial question, how to solve for that capacity question to be a global city.
Sam?
Yeah, mine are additive to the mayor's and Rebekah's. Let's accept the fact that we're going to have a huge industry called the autonomous vehicle industry that's coming. It's going to be mega-trillion, bigger than anything else we've seen. And the last time that we gave over our streets, it was to the automobile. Now it'll be to the AVs. I'd love to see cities have AV typology plans for their streets, that the AV industry, that the cities, the society all agree to. An AV cannot go into a pedestrian zone. It can't go fast in a school zone. It can't speed on a residential street. Okay. And an agreement on all the typologies there.
We have hardly any time, so Heidi, very quickly, and then.
So I'd like to find a way in which individuals' personal preferences about travel can actually be built into an integrated journey planning and booking system. And you know, if you go on to Journey Planner at the moment in London, it tells you which the fastest by public transport is. It tells you which has got step-free access, what route to do. But actually, I sort of think it can't be beyond the wit of man or woman to know that I would rather sit on a train for 10 minutes longer, follow a different route, if it meant that I got a seat, could do my emails, was more productive, and I knew that there was going to be a really overcrowded section of the tube network, but what I could see was that I could pick up an e-bike to complete the last 10 minutes of my journey. Everything's certain, I book it in, and I just sort of think that that ability to match people's personal preferences overlaid with what's right for the city as well, because let's be honest, the Public Transport Authority doesn't want me trying to cram myself onto the most congested part of the tube network. And I think there's great opportunity there using technology to provide a more individualized experience to people.
And Chris, very, very quickly.
Yes. 9 years ago, I sold my car. I have not bought one since. In the future, I don't want to ever buy one again. That is my vision for the future, and I think I want to be able to ride the 20 Madison bus or the 66 Chicago whenever I can for most of my trips. But for other trips, I want to be able to use services like a rideshare or TNC or other services that Uber offers to make it work.
Great. Please join me in thanking our panel.